The German system has 4 pillars of support, and without all 4, it doesn't work. Number 1, inexpensive energy supplies from Russia. It's the only place that the Germans can get the stuff cheap, and it forms the basis of their heavy industry, which provides the materials for their medium and their light industries. So if something happens that in the base level, it's not just that they have a problem with electricity, although they do. It's that they no longer have the materials that's necessary to make plastics or to forge steel or to do anything downstream of that. The Nord Stream pipeline went offline yesterday. There's a concern, a very real concern, that it's never going to come back on. What's going on right now is that the Russians are trying to blackmail the Germans into backing out of NATO. It's that simple. Because without German assistance, there are no logistical means of getting equipment from the rest of NATO into Ukraine. End of story. So the Germans are being forced to decide between being industrialized and neutral or unindustrialized and Western. Not a fun conversation to have. The Germans are the fastest aging society in Europe. They're in the top 5 globally. Germany is not a country where you can have an open, honest, national conversation about population policy. And it shows. And so they now have more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 20s. Until now, this has worked. Because when you have a lot of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s without kids, they can work long, they can work hard, they can get better educated, they're the most productive workers on the planet. But that group that is in the 60s is now flipping into retirement this decade, and that changes things overnight, going from an advanced worker base with lots of experience to a retired worker base where the experience is irrelevant. That happens this decade. That was always going to happen this decade. This was always going to be the last decade of the German manufacturing model. Third, it's not just about the Germans. A successful manufacturing system requires different stages of production with different workforces, with different skill sets at different costs. The Americans do this with Mexico. The Germans do this with Poland and the Czech Republic and Romania and Ukraine. And it's now over. And then finally, you need globalization. Because when you have an advanced population that's top-heavy, you don't have enough people to consume. You have to export the stuff. And the Americans have lost interest. So it's not just Nord Stream. That's just the proximate cause of the day. All 4 of these pillars were already breaking. The demographic ones were definitely going to break completely this decade. With the Americans, it all depends upon our mood. And then, of course, the Russians are just forcing things into the light right now. So the German manufacturing model cannot survive the 2020s. The Russians get to decide whether it survives 2022. The demographic situation now there is so bad that, and the aging is happening so quickly, and the birth rate dropped so low so long ago, that by 2050, the population of China will be less than half of what it is today. And we're already in a situation in I was going to phrase that wrong. Well, remember, Germany has more in their 60s and their 50s and their 40s and so on. Their demographic does this towards the children. China's does this.
Right.
Their point of no return was 30 years ago. This is not a recent thing. Combination of the fastest urbanization humanity has ever experienced with the one-child policy at the same time, that was national suicide, and now they're dying. They no longer have a workforce that is competitive in any manufacturing sector. There is not a product that is made anywhere else in the world there's not a product made in China that can't be made cheaper elsewhere. And the only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing power at all is because of the pre-existing sunk costs of the industrial plant, but the COVID lockdowns are even removing that from the table. So there's no reason to expect China to ever get better. Also, their energy comes from a continent away, except for the part that comes from 2 continents away. Also, all of the inputs that they need for their food, with the exception of phosphate fertilizer, they're all imported. So anything happens to globalization for any reason, and this is a country that just ceases to exist. There is no way with deglobalization that China emerges from this decade with more than 700 million people. It's going to be that bad and that catastrophic. It's a fun little compare and contrast. So the Russian demographic is awful. It will lead to a dissolution of the Russian state this century, probably around mid-century, if I was a betting man. But It's not so rapid because Russia, when it urbanized, it only urbanized in part, and when it industrialized, it only industrialized in part. So until you get to the post-Soviet collapse, the demographics really, I mean, they were ugly by many measures, but they weren't terminal. And there are some strategic things that the Russians can do to buy themselves more time. The Ukraine war is part of that. They're trying to get to a more defensible outer shell where they can put static forces in a few geographic areas that will block forces from coming into their space in the future. So I don't mean to suggest that the Russian situation is pretty. It is still terminal. But there are some things that you can do with strategic policy that buy more time. China doesn't have that option. Russia is an exporter of food and energy. China is an importer. Russia can plug its periphery. China's periphery is naval. There is no country or combination of countries that the Chinese can invade and conquer in order to solve any of their problems, where there's a nice list for the Russians. So the most likely outcome here is that China just kind of implodes into itself. Does that mean there can't be a war? Of course not. When countries are dying, you never know what they're going to do. The issue of the moment, of course, seems to be Taiwan. But the Chinese government now knows that if they make a move on Taiwan, it's A, going to be harder than they thought. B, they know there are going to be international sanctions. And C, they know there are going to be international boycotts. And any one of those is enough to destroy the Chinese system, much less all three at once. The Chinese have always thought of Russia as their dumb neighbor, and you let the dumb neighbor try things. They're the canary in the coal mine, if you will. And they now know that everything they've prepared for the last 40 years was based on faulty assumptions. This is normally the place where you would, as a national leader, send all of your smart people into another room to kind of game out some replacement plannings. But the cult of personality in China is now so tight, and Xi has executed so many people at the top that he no longer has a brain trust to send into the other room. So China's just slamming its head into the wall over and over and over and over until something cracks. And I don't think that something is going to be Taiwan. When the Russians did that first thunder run to Kharkiv and Kiev, and they realized that they were not going to be welcome in as saviors, that no one had bought their propaganda but themselves, they had to reassess. Ukraine, the problem with Ukraine from the Russian point of view is not that it's in one of those geographic gaps, it's that it's on the way to two of them. So it's not that the Russians aren't going to stop until they have all of Ukraine. It's that they won't stop when they have all of Ukraine. And that meant they had to dust off an older playbook. And that's why we're seeing all their artillery now. They're deliberately destroying every piece of civilian infrastructure they can see, specifically agricultural infrastructure, to make sure that the land is uninhabitable for at least several years, because that forces the population to self-segregate either into refugees, which leave and you don't have to worry about them, or anyone who just stays is clearly a fighter and you can set the Wagner group or the Chechens on them just to wipe them out. And that's what we've seen in southern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine for the most part. And we're seeing these incremental gains by artillery. If the Russians succeed, that doesn't simply destroy the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian state. It's just the next step in getting to those gaps. And that means Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Moldova, and Romania have to fall as well. On the western periphery of the Russian space, those are the countries that the Russians feel they have to